Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome back to Rare Classic Cars. Today, we haven't had a porch chat in a long time, so I thought we would, well, try one out. And it's a beautiful near fall day here. Summer is coming to an end on the weekend here. The weather is actually about perfect. It's about 70 degrees here in the Midwest, maybe a little bit cooler, but I don't know about you, but I love this kind of air in part because my vehicles like this. They don't tend to like the 90-degree kind of humid weather, just don't run as well as they do on a nice crisp day like today. But today we're going to talk about a topic that, well, maybe you have wondered a little bit about, and that is why were General Motors and Chrysler vehicles in particular of the 1980s so boxy? And what's amazing about this period is that Ford really departed from that philosophy when it came to their styling in the 1980s. What drove that? So let's talk a little bit more about that. First, you have to go back to a seminal vehicle for General Motors and really the auto industry, and that was the 1976 to 1979 Cadillac Seville. The Cadillac Seville that was introduced in 1976 was really a stretched Nova that Cadillac, frankly, did an excellent job of making into a true luxury vehicle. And when the vehicle was originally introduced, it was thought that it was going to be a lower price Cadillac. In fact, Cadillac had branded it as the LaSalle in some of the early customer clinics for that explicit purpose. And LaSalle, for those who don't know, was a nameplate that Cadillac launched kind of in that Depression era time frame so that they didn't have to lower the price of Cadillac. They introduced LaSalle, and then customers could buy that brand at a lower price than the Cadillac. And then when that era ended, LaSalle was retired, and Cadillac could take back the prestige and the sales associated with it. Well, when the Seville was introduced, it was, again, originally thought to be an entry price point Cadillac, but it clinicked so well with buyers, particularly on the coast, that Cadillac went from thinking about pricing at the low end of their overall portfolio to being the highest priced car, and that's what it was, aside from the Fleetwood 75 limousine. So that 76 to 79 Seville also was a huge sales success. And you have to take a look at the car, and you'll notice its extremely formal look. Very upright backlight, C-pillar. A-pillar doesn't have much rake to it either. It's a pretty stiff profile, but an overall elegant one. And part of the thought there too was on smaller vehicles, you want kind of that elegant, upright look, in part because that telegraphs things from the coach era, the coach builders era of automotive design. You used to have these big C-pillars because that helped provide privacy for the rear seat passengers, and that was a design cue that continued on into that time frame. And it also helped, that rather large greenhouse helped with interior room. But that car was so successful, it proved so seminal that it basically had styling, that styling proliferated almost every General Motors design aside from sports cars in the late 70s and 1980s, really until the late 80s, I would say. So if you exclude the Corvette, the Camaro, the Firebird, and you think about the mainstream sedans and the coupes, the 77 full-size vehicles had kind of a similar sheer look as what General Motors would have called it. When the A bodies were downsized in the late 70s, they had a similar look aside from the buttless Cutlass and its siblings, which GM actually revised very shortly to have the Seville roofline. And then when General Motors started introducing its front-wheel drive cars like the X-Car, at least the ones that were notchbacks, they had a similar roofline. The X-Car had that, the A-Car. So the X-Car would have been the Citation, the Phoenix, the Olds Omega, and the Buick Skylark. The A-Cars would have been the Chevrolet Celebrity, Pontiac 6000, Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, Buick Century. The J-Cars even had that, although they had a little Hofmeister kink, the kind of BMW style kink on the C-pillar. So that would have been the Cavalier, the J2000 or the 2000, later the Sunbird, the Olds Forenza, the Buick Skyhawk, not the Skylark, the Skyhawk, and the beloved Cadillac Cimarron. And when the C-Cars were introduced, that would have been the Cadillac DeVille, Fleetwood, as well as the Olds 98 and Buick Electra in 1985, they had a similar body style. And then the H bodies, which would have been the Olds 88, the Buick LeSabre, and then in 1987, the Pontiac Bonneville. So that look that look, that 76 to 79 Seville look is what proliferated General Motors' design for that time frame, really because it was so successful on the 76 to 79 Seville. And then for whatever reason, General Motors thought it was a great idea to put that roofline on basically every car that it had aside from sports cars. And that created some issues, as you can imagine. For those who know, there was an August 1983 Fortune cover that said, "Will success spoil General Motors?" And the premise there was that their cars were really getting to be look-alike. They had all that same roofline, and it was hard to distinguish. They had the roofline, they had the same, basically, greenhouse, a lot of the same doors, at least the door inners. Some of the door outers were a little bit different. And I think part of the issue there was that GM thought that it could get away with just redesigning front end and back end clips and not doing anything to the middle of the car, because that's what they had been doing for years, and they had done it successfully, including all the way, I would say, even before, but the 1959 cars are probably the best examples of that. And they share similar roof lines, they share the Buick doors, and well, I think they thought that they could just keep doing it, although the real estate in terms of the size of the car kept getting smaller and smaller, and hence Fortune published that magazine article that really, according to people that I know who were in GM design at the time, spooked them. And there were some other events that happened shortly thereafter. So that was August 1983, and you have to imagine at this time that, well, GM was still quite successful, but they had some other events that would spook them in the near future, mostly what Ford was going to be doing with its aerodynamic vehicles. Everybody remembers the 86 Taurus and Sable when that was introduced. But previous to that, Ford had the Aerobird Thunderbird and the Ford Tempo and the Mercury Topaz. And also, along with the Thunderbird, came out in 83, but a year later you have the Mark 7. And you also had, at the same time the Thunderbird was introduced, the Mercury Cougar. So all aerodynamic styled vehicles that came out from Ford. Chrysler still was in this super boxy design. The K cars, I think, would be hard-pressed to call anything but boxy. And part of this was, why were they so boxy? Some of it on the General Motors side was really heritage. They wanted that Cadillac upper end kind of roofline Q, and so it was GM heritage. But on the Chrysler side, it wasn't necessarily the heritage. It was really that design was also thought to be efficient. Remember, this is before aerodynamics really are taking off. And so a fill-the-box design, a design where you kind of take four corners and you are filling that box, whether it's with the passenger compartment or the fenders or the quarter panels, that's efficient. You're basically maximizing the amount of space in the passenger room that you can have by having this really upright sides, high greenhouse, kind of relatively high overall height for the cars. And I think that's part of the reason why Chrysler did it. Part of the reason was also to capitalize on some of the GM design heritage. But Chrysler and GM went that route. GM, again, wanted to capitalize on that 76 to 79 Seville heritage. And they also, as they were downsizing their cars, they thought it was too radical to change the styling philosophy dramatically. They wanted people to think of these cars as baby bigs almost, if you will. That they still resembled the big car. They still conjured up thoughts of the large car, and yet they were smaller. And so you have cars like the C cars, as I mentioned, the Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood, the Olds 98, and the Buick Electra in 1985, which were all new and front-wheel drive and had actually quite a bit of technology in them. Multi-port fuel injection, independent rear suspension. So some good technology, but if you look at the style of the cars, both on the outside and the inside still had these velour fabrics and big poofy seats often on the upper end models. The thought was to make somebody who came in and traded in their previous generation rear-wheel drive 98 or Electra or DeVille Fleetwood, make them happy. Despite the fact the car was small, the interior packaging on those cars actually was really, really good. And you didn't lose much overall space on the inside, so it wasn't that big of a stretch to think that despite them shaving off 18 inches in length and 800 pounds-ish in weight, that the buyers generally were quite happy. And in fact, the 85 C cars were some of the best selling full-size cars that GM ever produced. Unfortunately, they had some quality issues, but they were great sellers. The Olds 98 in 1985 was the best-selling Olds 98 to date. That 1985 Olds 98. Hard to believe, but true. Now, what's amazing about this is, so GM wanted to keep that because of its heritage. Ford went in a totally different direction with the aero vehicles. And that was really precipitated by a change in the chief designers at the time of Ford, from Gene Bourdonnais, who had led Ford styling for a number of years before that. And Gene Bourdonnais was, his last designs were really the Lincoln Mark VI. I mean, something you could design with a ruler and a T-square. I mean, you just, I mean, a kid could kind of draw it, almost like a Tesla Cybertruck. Gene Bourdonnais probably would have loved the Tesla Cybertruck with its very sharp angles. But that Mark VI, a lot of designers who were working at Ford at the time just loathed that car. It didn't signify anything new. There's nothing new about the Mark VI in terms of its design. And in fact, it's kind of, to my eye at least, an unfortunate decision, because the real estate got smaller versus the Mark V, and yet Ford decided to employ the same design philosophy, and it just doesn't work. The Mark V at least has a lot of real estate, where the look, I think, is elegant and tasteful, if somewhat dated, but I think it's a good-looking car. The Mark VI, it's just not a happy car, shall we say. And Bourdonnais, his last full-size cars were the Crown Victoria, the Mercury Marquis, that came out in 1979, that again were very boxy. Now those proved very successful. I think they're less boxy than the Mark VI. The Mark VI is kind of the exemplifies everything about the Bourdonnais era, if you will. But there was a design change at the top of Ford leadership that came, and that was that Gene Bourdonnais retired, and an individual by the name of Jack Telnack took over North America design. And Jack, along with his contemporaries, really envisioned something completely new for Ford design. Some would even say they kind of pushed Gene Bourdonnais out the door. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think it was just Bourdonnais' time had come. It was time to look for a new direction in design. And so Jack Telnack was the one who led this new Ford design renaissance with, as I mentioned, the Thunderbird, Cougar, Mark VII, Tempo, Topaz, Taurus, and Sable. Kind of that whole stable of vehicles they came out with in the early 80s to mid-80s. The amazing thing about Ford is that they went to this aerodynamic design with the doors into the roof, kind of like the aircraft have. And Ford didn't have a wind tunnel, their own wind tunnel. GM did. GM by this point had their own wind tunnel. So GM was doing, let's say, less aerodynamic design, having a wind tunnel, and Ford was doing super aerodynamic design, and they didn't have one. And I think some of those Ford designs are extremely beautiful, aesthetically appealing, and certainly revolutionary for the time when you contrast them with what GM and Chrysler had in the marketplace. Of course, after the introduction of that 86 Taurus and Sable in particular, and the success that it had, it was just a runaway success, and the Taurus became the #1 selling American car in America for a number of years until it was unfortunately taken over by the Toyota Camry later on. But the Taurus held that sales crown for many, many years. And that was in part due to that avant-garde styling, that 86 Taurus. And my favorite is the Sable with the light bar grille up front, the skirted rear wheel, which the Taurus doesn't have. But that car was kind of a copy of the Audis that had come out before that. And I think Ford did a great job. I mean, it doesn't totally look like an Audi, but it looks modern. And they still look good today. Now that design, when it was introduced, really set GM back on its heels. And GM design also went through a revolution around that time frame in terms of its leadership. Irv Ribicki, who had been the styling leader since Bill Mitchell's retirement in 1977, would retire in 1986, and Chuck Jordan would take over. Now there's a whole controversy there too, that when Bill Mitchell retired in 1977, his hand-picked successor was actually Chuck Jordan. But GM leadership and the board went with Irv Ribicki, I think in part because Chuck Jordan's personality was similar to Bill Mitchell's, rather abrasive. And that just wasn't viewed favorably. GM leadership didn't want another Bill Mitchell candidate. They wanted somebody who was going to be a team player. And Chuck wasn't that, or at least wasn't perceived to be that, in fairness to him, in General Motors leadership's mind. So Irv Verbicki got the job, and he got it from the time Bill Mitchell retired in 77 to 86. And you can see that the cars of that era, from 77 to 86, were really a continuation of what Bill Mitchell had done. Of course, the 82 Camaro and Firebird, I think, are two great-looking cars. Unfortunately, not well assembled or manufactured, but great-looking cars. Stand out. Still today, great-looking cars. The 84 Corvette, I love the C4 for its looks. Beautiful car. All those cars, by the way, were done by Jerry Palmer, who led the Chevrolet studio at the time. I believe it was Chevy 3 that did those vehicles. And he also was in charge of a car called the Aerovet, a concept car in the 70s that is one of my favorites of all time. So kudos to Jerry Palmer for doing those. But when the 86 Taurus Sable came out, and GM also had a change in design leadership, then you start seeing General Motors cars coming out with things that were more avant-garde. In 88, you have the introduction of the W cars, which weren't sales successes. For whatever reason, GM program planning decided to come out with the coupes first. I don't know why, and then the sedans later. Probably not a great move. But the 88 Cutlass Supreme, the Regal, I think they're good looking. They don't have quite the right ride height. They look a little funny in terms of how they sit. But I think they're good looking cars overall. The Chevy Lumina. So, those were, I would say, some of the early start. And then you get the Olds Aurora in 95. You get the Cadillac Seville and Eldorado in 1992. And you get a very radical Firebird and Camaro as well to replace the ones that came out in 1982. And that's kind of the Chuck Jordan era of GM design. I think it really started the trend toward more aero and more futuristic looking styling at General Motors. But, again, I thought it was just an interesting conversation to say, well, why were GM cars so boxy and Chrysler cars so boxy in the late 70s, early 80s? In part just due to the heritage, in part due to that 76 to 79 Seville success, in part due to the fact that designers at the time thought that filling the box, so to speak, was the most efficient design overall. And also you have design leadership that really didn't change. That was true at Chrysler too. Don De La Rosa was the styling chief at Chrysler. It would take until Tom Gale took over, I believe in the late 80s, and then Tom Gale and his team introduced the Chrysler Portofino concept that introduced the cab forward design. And then you get some beautifully shaped cars, the first generation Chrysler LH cars. The Intrepid is an example. The Chrysler Concorde, the Eagle Vision, I think is my favorite. Beautiful, beautiful cars that Tom Gale's team came out with. Then they came out with the Cloud cars, the Cirrus, the Stratus, later the Plymouth Breeze. Again, good lookers, for sure. But that took the leadership changing hands from Don De La Rosa to Tom Gale. And I think it's amazing. Don't always fault the designers for what they come out with. Sometimes it's just a product of what they're told. Tom Gale was one of the leads on that last generation Imperial, that horrible looking stretch K car, again, my personal opinion, with the Grecian waterfall grille, that huge front overhang, that angular waterline with the vinyl toupee, on the top of it. Oh, that car. But he was one of the leads on that. And then he comes out with the first generation LH cars. That's really because Tom Gale was kind of doing what his bosses told him to do. And what more can we do sometimes than what our supervisors tell us? So there's a little bit of a heritage on why GM cars were so boxy and why Ford went in a totally different direction, because they had really the earliest change of design leadership, moving to Jack Telnack from Gene Bourdonnais. And Chrysler would eventually follow suit. So hope that shed some light on some things for you and that you enjoyed this porch chat. If you enjoy the porch chats, make sure to put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.